All right, everybody, and welcome to this episode of FinServ Tech Oracles. I'm Johna Johnson here with my oracular colleague Jerry Murphy, and we're going to have a lively conversation on cryptocurrency for financial
Too
services
lively.
firms. Too lively. Oh no, this is great. And now, what happened was Jerry. Well, two things. One is the recently announced, I should say, Republican VP candidate JD Vance has made a point of strongly supporting cryptocurrencies. I don't know if he's still running. Presidential candidate RFK Jr. talked about putting the U.S. budget on cryptocurrencies. And cryptocurrencies are kind of seeing a renaissance in, popular culture. So let's start with number one. Jerry, what's a cryptocurrency and why should we care?
Well, as simple as I can make it, cryptocurrencies are virtual currencies that are guarantee their uniqueness by the algorithms by which they're created, and you can track who bought a particular currency at what time and how much it was bought for at any given time. And so the theoretic beauty of a cryptocurrency is, unlike say the US dollar, which is worth what the federal government says, trust me, here's a dollar and it's worth a dollar, backed by the federal government. The virtual currencies, cryptocurrencies are really not backed by anything. There's a swarm of machines out there that are all working together to generate algorithms to do this distributed ledger to validate, this thing is uniquely what it is, and I can prove that Jerry owns it or Johna owns it. Sort of that's it. So it's virtual. It's distributed. The virtual currency community would say that's a good thing because we don't have to worry about or trust any government to say what something is said with. And I guess I would just question whether or not that lack of trust is a good thing or a bad thing. We could probably debate for hours or days
I
on
don't know that we could
whether
debate.
that's a
I think,
merit or a handicap.
yeah, I think you and I kind of tend, in most things, we are very libertarian, but we tend towards the authoritarian on certain things like that. And but I guess so. When you say it's kind of a currency where the community determines its worth, it's kind of like the stock market, except behind the stock market, there are actual real companies. So it's weird because behind the dollar, you've got the force of the U.S. government. Behind the stock market, you've
Yep.
got ostensibly real companies that are actually making real products that you can touch and
Yep.
feel. And behind cryptocurrencies, you've got neither one, right?
Yep. And here's a point that I think people will grasp, right? My wife's a real estate agent, right? And people have houses. Houses are actual things, right? They're sitting
Mm-hmm.
on ground. They have structure and they're 1,000, 2,000, 5,000 square feet, right? They're a certain size with certain amenities. But what are they, quote, worth?
Worth.
And the reality is they're worth what somebody's willing to pay for it. And what is somebody willing to pay for it? And the reality is that's going to change based on the weather. My wife will often have somebody say, "Oh, somebody wants me to sell their house," and they're complaining because they said, "Well, my neighbor's house sold 6 months ago for 550,000. Why are you telling me to sell mine for 500,000? Mine is much nicer house than theirs." I think people can appreciate the fact that yeah, my house is worth what somebody's willing to pay for it, and what they're willing to pay for it is actually going to change based on the economy and a bunch of different factors. So the only thing I would add when you're thinking about virtual currencies is, while the house may be worth what somebody's willing to pay for it, at the end of the day, there is a physical property that is ultimately has some intrinsic value. The question is, what is the intrinsic value of the digital currencies? We can agree that, yeah, and we say on a daily basis, a Bitcoin is worth, today on the market, it's worth whatever, $12,000, $20,000, $17,000. But then my second question is, yeah, it's going to be worth whatever somebody's
Well,
willing to pay for it today. What is it ultimately that's backing? What is the intrinsic value of that thing? And unlike a house, unlike a stock, I sit there and scratch my head and say, what is the intrinsic value of this thing that people are,
Well,
quote,
I mean,
buying?
I think that was the issue that was raised back at the beginning of cryptocurrencies. And I'll give you two conflicting responses. The first one is, I loved your comment that it's not really what people will pay is not really transitive, because it's sort of, you can say, okay, this thing is worth what all these people have said today they're willing to pay, but you can't sort of, you can't you can say people are willing to pay X for something, but you can't really say it's worth X. And I know what economics says, but you can't say it's worth X because there's no guarantee that they'll be willing to pay it tomorrow. And whether they will or not depends on lots of things: supply and demand, like you said, the weather, the mood in the stock market, blah blah blah. But at the end of the day, there is some. I look at my house, to use your example, and it's been worth twice as much as it is now in the recent past, and it's been worth half as much as it is now in the recent past, and somewhere in there is what I can expect to get for it should I ever wish to sell it. But I think the argument that the cryptocurrency people will make is that the value of cryptocurrency is the commitment by the community that they will pay a certain amount, and that certain amount, the unspoken assumption is that a certain amount, like my house, is never going to vary beyond parameters, some set of parameters. It's never going to go to zero. It's never going to go into infinity. It's going to stay between some parameters. And I think your point seems to be, no, those parameters are set by the existence of one of two things: a government or a physical commodity like a house or, gold. And absent those two things, there's no way to guarantee that your currency will go to zero or go to infinity. To which the response usually is, yeah, well, government-backed currencies haven't done so well. Look at the Weimar Republic and their, 10,000% inflation happening. Yeah. So I guess it becomes a philosophical debate of, and I think this is where we got lively. Who do you trust? Do you trust the broad community, the mob, relatively speaking, or do you trust the government? And the cryptocurrency people would say, we trust the community, not the government. And standard currency people would say, we trust the government rather than the community.
And then, when you say trusting the community, it's one thing to sit there, and I think a lot of these cryptocurrency people have this vision that there's a bunch of these altruistic people sitting there in the computers talking about the virtues of life and all that. But let's peel this back a second. Who actually owns and controls all the data centers that are doing all these calculations, that are creating all this currency in the first place? Is it really 20 million Joe Schmoes and Jane Does? Or is it actually venture capital based companies who are actually buying millions and billions of dollars of data center real estate and servers and all these things that are actually generating all these bitcoins in the first place?
Well, and as you were talking, Jerry, I was thinking to myself, the broligarchs, which is my big new word of the week, the broligarchs. And that's what it really comes down to. You may hate the government, any particular government, and in fact, governments do turn bad. The past 100 years has given us ample example of that. We all know it. But at the same time, it's sort of damned if you do, damned if you don't, because, as Robert Heinlein once said, democracy is predicated on the assumption that 1,000 men can make a better decision than one man. But authoritarianism is predicated on the assumption that one man can make a better decision than 1,000 men. How's that again?
Well, one man can make a decision quicker than 1,000 men. Whether or not that quicker decision is good or bad, it's highly dependent on the person making the decision, I think.
Exactly. And you can't assume that 1,000 people are necessarily any intrinsically better than 1,000 people in the service of government, for example. So they might be, they might not be. So I think that's the problem. And as you and I were talking about, this almost becomes a philosophical debate, because essentially in the absence of government, every single time I've ever seen it, with a handful of exceptions that we can get into, everything devolves into mob rule. So what happens is you may have a peaceful little community with very little government, happily, like the Patuxent Native Americans in my part of the world were happily eating oysters and not killing each other and living beautifully. And then the other tribal nations came in and killed them, because the guys with the guns, the guys with the weapons will usually come in and take charge violently of the sort of peaceful little communities. So
most of these peaceful little communities are more fiction than fact. I mean, think about like the Iroquois Nation. You talk about Indian tribes.
they weren't.
People
They
think
weren't
about how
peaceful.
beautifully peaceful the Iroquois Nation was. Well,
they weren't,
for
though.
thousands of years, they were pretty violent, and there was one tribe that stuck out and was absolutely refusing. And at some point, they got
just
snot
killed
kicked out of them, and they finally acquiesced and joined the nation.
Yeah,
so
no, in this
it looks
particular
on
case,
surface like it's this beautiful, well-oiled machine, but that oiled machine.
My point was exactly this. The Patuxent were actually very well known for being peaceful, which is why they don't exist anymore. And that's kind of what we get to, which is a long way away from cryptocurrency, but it is actually the main point. And getting back to financial services firms, the question is, if you're a bank, do you really want to be trusting the oligarchs more than you trust the U.S. dollar? Do you want to be hedging your bets with a bet on cryptocurrency? I don't know, Jerry. I mean, banks tend to be cold-hearted. They don't care. So
and I guess from my perspective, the big lesson I learned from all this is there are some values in cryptocurrencies. I mean, there are some things with the technology, right? The fact that the distributed ledgers, the blockchains, there's things in the technology that are going to be very useful for security, for identity management, for asset management. So there's a lot of things that technology has that are, in fact, very useful. So I can't say that the existence of cryptocurrency hasn't brought some associated technologies that are very valuable people can use. But when you're just going to say cryptocurrencies in and of themselves, I still come down to it's not an investment, it's speculation. And so am I going to say, should you not, quote, invest in cryptocurrencies? And my point is, they're not investments, they're speculative. So as long as you understand that, and there's a certain amount of your portfolio that you can speculate as opposed to invest, go for it. But don't kid yourself to thinking they're investments. They are and will remain
But I will push back. I will push back, Jerry, that quite a lot of our clients are pretty sophisticated banks that essentially all they do is speculate. They speculate on currency, they speculate on futures.
Right? I mean, commodities, future. I mean, betting on, people, so people, will bet on what's the price of oil, what's the price of orange juice, what's the price of pork bellies. But let's not kid ourselves. It's gambling, right? The fact that I'm going to guess what oil or pork bellies or orange juice are worth in 2 months is a guess. It's not science. It is speculation. Now, maybe speculation based on some very smart analytics, but you don't know whether, a hurricane is going to come and wipe out that orange crop, or some prince is going to cut some backdoor deal.
But Jerry, you're just talking about all of Wall Street. 90% of Wall Street's efforts is speculation. So if you're a Wall Street firm that does speculate, do you have any recommendations for speculating safely or effectively in cryptocurrency?
Well, I mean, to me, it would be, I would absolutely limit my portfolio on it. If I'm going to speculate on these types of things, I would only do the ones that have very large bases of installed users that create a market that is a transactable market. I mean, literally, there's 100,000 of these currencies out there. And we all know, Bitcoin is the main one. There's other ones there like Ethereum, so if you're going to invest in these things, and I hate using the word invest. I would
but you're Goldman Sachs. You're not investing. You're whatever the hell it is they do what they're doing.
Like I said, like optionary things. So stay with very large market-based ones and recognize they are speculative, highly variable. And if you're going to do it, I would say never have it be a very large part of your portfolio. There's just too much.
I think that makes sense. I mean, it's high risk. It's high risk of a lot of things. There's high risk of collapse. There's high risk of massive change. There's also high risk that somebody involved, one of these oligarchs, ends up committing fraud and going to jail, and they want your investment. So,
and at the end of the day, let's not forget, right? At the end of the day, there's nothing ultimately backing these things up, and all these other things that we're talking about, right?
That point was made. Yes.
Orange, oil, gold. At the end of the day, all of those other speculative commodities actually have something intrinsic.
But we know that, Jerry. I mean, everybody knows that. I know we set the stage, but for 15 years, everybody's understood the whole beauty of cryptocurrencies is they're just an agreement to assign a value. And that could go to zero in a heartbeat. And we all know that.
Yeah.
And Goldman
Yep.
Sachs, I'm sure, knows that. And JP Morgan knows that. But if you want to translate what I think is most interesting from what you just said is if you want to translate that into something you do on a daily basis, keep it limited. Like any other risky element of your portfolio, you know, it's great to make a bunch of money in the short term, but keep it limited because otherwise you can get out over your skis. And, you know, we saw what happened in the 80s and in every other crash in '08 and every other crash since then. You know, just be reasonably cautious in line with your corporate stance towards risk.
I can tell you how much of it's in my portfolio.
Yes, but you're conservative with a small c, and we know this. And I actually, in fairness, I don't think Warren Buffett has invested either, which should tell you something.
There you go.
So on that note, we have run way long, but as we said, it would be a lively discussion. If you are interested in hearing more about cryptocurrencies or anything else we have to say about financial services firms, please join us Tuesdays at 9 a.m. just before the markets open. We are your FinServ Tech Oracles.